everyone, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. Today we're going to talk about borderline personality disorder, or BPD, and a treatment approach that I like to use with BPD. As many of you know, I am a trauma therapist. I love working with this population. This particular disorder has a lot of stigmatization and a lot of misunderstanding about the disorder. And it gets a bad rap kind of out there in the community and just mental health literature in general. And what I would like to do today is to destigmatize it and to talk about a treatment method that doesn't pathologize borderline personality disorder and create a potential for more harm. This population already suffers from an intense self-loathing, self-hatred, problems with identity, and they already feel intense shame and unworthiness. So the last thing I want to do with any client who has BPD is to make them feel worse about themselves. So we're going to cover that today. We'll talk about some common symptoms of BPD. So for those of you who might not be as familiar, kind of what this disorder looks like as far as symptoms. But then we're going to also talk about my favorite approach to treating BPD, and that's internal family systems therapy, or IFS. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment. I'll link my longer slideshow on IFS below as well if you guys would like to learn more about IFS more in detail. But I'll cover a pretty good beginner's primer on it today anyway. So you won't have to be completely familiar with it to understand some of the concepts I'll be talking about today. As always, please like and subscribe to my channel. Please watch the video all the way through if you can. That really helps my channel grow and the YouTube algorithm figure out who to push my videos out to. And I so appreciate all of your support. And I really hope you find this video helpful. Treating trauma is an absolute passion of mine, and I actually really love working with this population. So without further ado, let's get started. So let's talk about some common symptoms of borderline personality disorder. If you just saw the slide directly right before this and it went by a little too fast for you, no worries. Feel free to pause the video at any time if you would like to read the slides more thoroughly. The reason for this is what I'm finding is if I show a slide and then I try to talk afterwards, somewhere in the video editing software, it creates a voice discrepancy between my words and what you're hearing, and it's absolutely driving me bananas and I can't figure it out. So to try to prevent that, I'm not going to be messing around and showing the slides for a long period of time because that seems to mess up the audio. So if at any time, feel free to pause so that you can kind of read the slide, and then I'll talk about the slide in more detail when you actually see me speaking. And that way, hopefully, crossing fingers, it will avoid that weird audio video lag that I'm experiencing when I upload it to YouTube. Very annoying. Not quite sure how to fix it. If anybody knows, feel free to drop me a comment. All right, so common symptoms of BPD. So BPD is a personality disorder rooted in trauma. So this comes from childhood abuse and trauma. There is potentially some genetic predisposition to a person's temperament, for example, or the way they respond to life stressors that might make them more predisposed to develop BPD. But all in all, in general, what we see is extensive childhood abuse and neglect going on in this population. So some of the symptoms are poor self-image. So they're going to have a hard time with identity and how they see themselves and self-worth. Feelings of emptiness. So it's very common for them to kind of walk around and feel empty inside, which makes them more prone to kind of want to get into relationships to try to solve the emptiness. But the emptiness is from a core wound, and we'll talk more about that later when I talk about IFS. Difficulty with being alone. So the idea of abandonment and aloneness and loneliness is a very painful emotion that drives a lot of their distress. Again, wounded parts, we'll talk about those more. Intense emotions that are difficult to control. So if any of you do have BPD, or if you have a loved one with BPD, you'll notice some intense swings in emotions that can be quite volatile sometimes, or quite scary, both to the person experiencing them and also for the loved one who is maybe on the receiving end of some of those volatile emotions. Relationships can be characterized by lots of distress or conflict because of that volatility in emotions. So people with BPD have a hard time tolerating distress and also with emotion regulation or being able to control painful emotions. Also impulsivity. So part of the reason why some of their behaviors cause so much distress too is they're very impulsive. So it's very hard for them to control some of the behaviors they have if they are highly distressed or emotionally, feeling a lot of pain. So it makes it harder for them to control their behavior. Self-harm or suicidality. That's commonly seen in this population. Again, those core wounds from childhood of unworthiness and not feeling good enough and feeling unlovable drive this high degree of distress and emptiness that causes the greater likelihood that they might engage in self-harming behaviors or suicidality potentially, especially if they are in a high state of distress and they perceive somebody they love as going to abandon them or reject them in some way. That can really cause the suicidality to kind of swing up more in the severe range and can be quite clinically very important to address as well. When they're distressed, splitting occurs. If you've never heard of the term splitting, that's basically where very quickly they will have an incorrect perception of someone else's thoughts or feelings or behaviors and react to that person out of their incorrect perceptions. So again, their perceptions are based in trauma. So if we have perceptions that are not based in reality, but are actually trauma-based, it's going to drive a wide degree of distress and inaccurate perceptions that can cause a lot of distress in this population. And you'll see kind of a rapid extreme shift too in how they perceive somebody, depending on whatever is triggering them in the moment. They have a deep fear of abandonment. I mentioned that already. And they can feel lonely even within an intimate relationship. So they might be married or have a long-term boyfriend or girlfriend or partner and still feel this intense sense of loneliness. So again, that's that inner childhood wound driving that particular distress. And we'll get to that in a minute. And they also idealize partners, friends, or family members. So they can kind of put us up on a pedestal sometimes. And we're kind of like become their savior or the person they rely or depend on. But then inevitably, if we disappoint them in some way, shape, or form, boom, they'll knock you right off the pedestal, and it becomes the kind of the devaluation cycle where you're seen as the enemy and can possibly be on the receiving end of very intense rage or mood shifts that can be kind of scary and volatile as well. So again, all of this is stemming from childhood abuse and neglect. And if you've seen some of my other videos, it stems from attachment trauma, specifically disorganized attachment trauma or insecure attachment or anxious attachment style. So those two different attachment styles can drive the formation of BPD, and I'll link that video below as well in case you want to know more about that. So unlike some of the other therapeutic approaches, IFS really conceptualizes borderline patients as a wounded child, essentially. So we are not pathologizing them. We see them as a human being that at one point in their life before they were wounded, they had this access to this beautiful, wise, authentic part of them that we call self-energy. But because of trauma, there's a break or a disconnect between who we really are and the trauma symptoms. So trauma kind of drives the bus and it splits us off from being our authentic self. So IFS is all about restoring self-leadership or our authentic self. So instead of trauma symptoms and the thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that go along with being a trauma survivor or victim of abuse and neglect, we restore the natural, healthy connection to our actual authentic self. And instead, we call that self-leadership. So self gets to drive the bus is what I like to say, instead of wounded child parts. I mean, the analogy I like to give here is pretend you go into a kindergarten classroom and there's no teacher present. So the teacher would represent this beautiful, wise, adult self-energy that has the capacity for connection and compassion and clarity and all of those wonderful adult qualities that help us, drive our lives in a really productive way. Well, if that teacher's not present in the classroom, you can imagine the absolute chaos from a bunch of 5 and 6-year-olds with no adult present. So that's kind of like what it is inside of us. So when we're trauma survivors, whether you have borderline personality disorder or another trauma-related disorder like complex PTSD, we all have wounded parts. All of us. So that's what's so wonderful about IFS that's non-pathologizing, is we all have wounded parts. So in this way, it's taking, any stigmatization out of the picture. It's normalizing the wounds and the pain and the distress that they cause. And it's giving hope that there is an answer, that if your connection to authentic self was broken, good news, it can be restored. And it can be restored specifically with IFS and a good trauma therapist. So really, the point of IFS is all of us have an unwounded core self of who we authentically really are, and that your suffering comes from the childhood wounds that you inherited from your parents, who also probably were grown wounded children themselves and did not know how to raise children in a healthy way. And that, your trauma and your trauma symptoms are not actually who you are. They are symptoms expressed as parts trying to survive. So all of our wounded parts are based in survival, and we'll talk about that next. So in BPD, or with any disorder rooted in childhood trauma, it's helpful to conceptualize the actual symptoms as wounded children. So, for example, if you have a wound related to not feeling good enough or feeling unworthy, how old were you when that wound first came on board? Were you 5, 6, 7? If you go back to your earliest memory of when you started feeling that way, you can probably target how old this part actually is. So it's important when we're relating to our wounded parts that we're not coming in and harshly criticizing and shaming and blaming and hurting them as we were hurt in our lives, right? That they are tiny little children just trying to survive. And that's really the core of what happened here. That fight, flight, freeze, and fawn is the people-pleasing one, the 4 F's here of survival. Remember that our bodies and brains did not choose any of these survival responses. They just automatically happen in this, just as quick as I snapped my finger, even quicker, that the brain chose that to help us survive intense traumatic experience in our childhood. So in BPD, for example, if you had an extremely volatile or scary caregiver, you might have had a strong freeze response where you kind of disassociated and just numbed out and your brain went elsewhere to keep you safe. Or, people who've been sexually abused, they have also a very strong freeze or disassociating part that helps them survive those terrible experiences. Or sometimes they have like a fawn response of just trying to please the abuser to make them stop or to make the abuser go away. If I can just please the abuser, maybe they'll leave me alone, for example. So we have various trauma responses, running from the distress as well, like isolating and kind of shutting down and protecting ourselves from people. That's another trauma response. Fighting is another one. So if you have a very strong rage or anger part, that was a part that probably felt backed into a corner at one point with no way out, and boom, it reacts with explosive rage. So all of these parts are just based in survival. I find that when I'm doing IFS, all of these parts relate in some way, shape, or form to those 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Okay, let's talk about the 3 different parts that are key to understanding IFS. So IFS is going to talk about exiles. So those are the original wounds that our parents gifted us, I guess you could say, due to the abuse and trauma. So I put some simple ones on here. By no means is this an exclusive list, but to give you an idea, some exiles of like feelings of unworthiness, dependency, like feeling like you need somebody, feeling like you're too much, feeling like you're not enough, rejected or feeling, abandoned, loneliness, shame. So those are the core actual wounds that our abusive parents instilled in us due to the traumatic experiences. And so what happens is those wounds are very, very painful, as you can imagine. And so what happens is we get two protectors on board to try to make the pain stop. So in IFS, no part is a bad part. Not even in BPD, no part is a bad part. Our job is to understand with compassion what the part needs so that we can help this part learn to self-soothe and trust self-leadership. So managers are one of the parts that kind of manage our pain and distress on a regular basis, but in a less, I would say a less devastating or potentially very negative way, like firefighters. So firefighters are more extreme. So, if you're experiencing extreme or intense emotion, firefighters are probably going to come to the rescue very swiftly to react, to put out the fire, so to speak. So firefighters are like your anger and your rage that we see in BPD, very explosive rage. So that tells me that something in there triggered one of these primary wounds. Maybe it's a wound of abandonment, or maybe it's a wound of unworthiness or fear of being rejected, etc. Something is responding or causing the body to respond as if this were an extreme threat. And fight might be a primary protector that helps you stay safe by fighting off the threat, for example. Suicide is another one that's common with BPD. Suicide is a very interesting protector because suicide is one that's like the last ditch resort of, if I can't make the pain stop with any other way, then at least I can make the pain stop by killing myself. Self-harm is another one. Sometimes people mistakenly think self-harm is related to suicidality, but actually a lot of times self-harm is just to feel something. So if they are just so strongly disassociated or frozen, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, frozen, right? That's the body's primary response of keeping safe. Sometimes people will cut or self-harm just to feel something. That's the closest they can feel to, being alive. Disassociation. So that would be another protector as well, that if the traumatic experience or distressing feeling is bad enough, okay, let's just take you elsewhere. Your mind will not be here in the present moment, and we'll just take you elsewhere and help you numb out. Depression is another number as well that is a protector, a manager. Depression is more of a manager. So the managers are a little bit less extreme. So a lot of times people kind of like their managers because they're helping them kind of deal with everyday life in a less destructive way. So things like anxiety or over-worrying, overthinking, if I can just, think about 50,000 different ways, I'll find a solution for this problem and it won't be able to hurt me. So yeah, the over-anxious, over-worry part is definitely in response to feeling out of control. And a way to get control back is by overanalyzing everything to the 10th degree so that I can feel safe knowing I have some sort of option to respond. Control freak, that's another one. It's like the Karen or the criticizer in the system. Sorry to any Karens out there. I like to joke around and call the criticizer a Karen, but if you're a nice Karen, this doesn't apply to you. But yeah, it's like here's the criticizer all day long, like, you're not doing anything right, and the criticizer's job is, well, if you just stop screwing up, nobody would abandon you. So for the part, it makes perfect sense why they're trying to help. If you would just do what they said, things would be just fine. So yeah, we can get some like control freak parts in there too that are really, really causing distress in the system. People pleasing is another one that I commonly see. So yeah, if I just twist myself into all sorts of pretzel knots, finally my abuser will love me and accept me. And that one is one of the saddest ones, I think, because especially when it comes to an abusive parent, nothing we do will ever make that abusive parent love us. And that is one of the core wounds that we have to heal when we grow up with abusive childhoods and complex trauma, is that wound of fundamentally feeling like we're not worthy or good enough or lovable. But the reality is, when we heal from this type of trauma, we recognize that we were always worthy and that the abusive parent actually was incapable of loving us in the way that we needed. Not that we were unlovable, but the parent was incapable. It's a totally different thing. So that goes under grief and loss as well. I have videos on grief and loss and how we get to acceptance. So if you're interested in that topic, feel free to check my other videos out on grief and loss. So in sum, how these parts are born is our attachment needs were not met as children. So when we are tiny little babies, for survival, we must attach to a caregiver and bond with them and form a relationship with them to survive. So when parents are abusive and volatile and scary and erratic and, whether it's sexual abuse or emotional abuse, all the abuses, what that does is it disrupts a normal, healthy attachment between parent and child. In my other videos, we talk about disorganized and insecure attachment or anxious attachment as being two of the main attachment styles underlying BPD. Avoidant attachment underlies complex PTSD. But essentially, our attachment needs were not met. So all of us are born having needs for like safety and love and affection and connection. And when our parent was incapable of meeting our needs, it's going to cause some serious damage. And if our parent acted in very volatile or erratic or, scary ways, that is going to do some major damage. And so what this happens is that we get, instead of our core authentic self being able to really grow and develop over time, that gets stunted. We don't have access to self. Instead, all of our energy got devoted to survive, just survival needs. That's it. And so that's the exiles are the original wounds, and the protectors, the two protectors I just talked about, are really focused on helping us survive day to day, because again, the environment is lacking all types of safety. And so we really are just attempting to get our basic needs met for safety and survival. And so that's really what these parts are focused on helping us do. And those higher order needs of like identity and purpose and meaning, throw those out the window. Those are not going to develop in trauma survivors. And, those are qualities of self. Leadership and self-energy is having access to like purpose and meaning and identity and connection and seeing things clearly and courage and all of that. Yeah. Talk more about self-energy and what that looks like here in just a minute. All right. So self-energy or self-leadership has some very specific qualities. So you will know that you are in self-energy or have access to self if at different times of your life you have felt some of these things. These are called the 8 C's of self. And essentially, self is our unwounded, authentic, wise, compassionate adult self that is capable of leading all of our wounded parts. So again, it's like the teacher in the classroom. So instead of the classroom not having a teacher to kind of guide and mentor and nurture the kids throughout the day, it's a classroom without a teacher. So we want that teacher back. And what a good teacher or self-energy feels like is parts of us that have access to compassion, parts of us that have access to courage. So even when things are scary, we can push through. Curiosity. Curiosity is a huge component of healing, because instead of judging and criticizing our wounded parts, we're just going to get curious about what they need. What is their story? What are they afraid of? So curiosity is a huge component here that encourages compassion and insight. Connection. So self-energy has the ability to feel connected not only to ourselves, but to other people. Creativity. So exploration, playfulness, creativity, those are self-qualities. Calmness, kind of that beautiful, centered, calm, Zen energy. That's a self-quality. Clarity. So again, clarity with BPD, what we know is there's an extreme swing in how they perceive a lot of things that causes a lot of distress. So clarity is about finding the middle ground. What does my mind have to say about this? Not the polarized parts here that are in a tug of war and causing a lot of distress, but what does our beautiful, wise, authentic self that has access to wisdom in all of these 8 C's, what does that part of us think about whatever the situation is? That's going to be a different answer than a part. A part is always going to be quite extreme in how it responds to things. Self is much different. It's much calmer. It has great clarity. It can see things accurately. It responds with courage, but also compassion and centeredness and confidence. There's confidence as well to self-energy. So if you're beginning to kind of get a feel here, probably just by some of these descriptors of what self-energy feels like, and maybe you're thinking by now, oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever felt self-energy. How the heck can I begin to build this? Keep watching. We're going to find that out here. So another great analogy here that I like to describe when I talk about self and school teachers and kids in a classroom, another one is a captain of the ship here. So again, if we are traumatized or abused as kids, we do not have a strong sense of self. And it's like being in a boat in a storm without a captain. So inevitably, as we know, life stressors happens to the best of us, happens all of us at some point are going to go through something in life that is either traumatic or stressful, ups and downs, right? Life is really never purely easy day to day. So what happens is there is no captain at the helm of the ship going through the storm. And naturally, if no one's guiding the ship, it goes down in the waves and it sinks. So this is why it's so important to build self-energy with BPD or any other complex PTSD or any other disorder, is because really it's our systems do not have a captain. And if we don't have a captain, we are not going to be able to guide our ships or our lives basically in an authentic way that is, has access to all of those 8 C's and wisdom and clarity and purpose and meaning. So we really want that captain. Another important aspect of self-energy is that self is like a wise parent. So if we were not parented at all in a wise or compassionate way as children, which of course, if we're coming in here with BPD or complex PTSD, etc., we did not have a wise, compassionate parent. We had a grown, wounded child, basically children raising children, because a lot of our abusive parents never grew past the emotional age of maybe a young child themselves. And they were really parenting us from all of their wounded parts, and hence the damage, right? Can you imagine for a moment if your parent actually had access to their authentic self, who would they have been? Who would they have been? It's probably mind-boggling, right? I can't even imagine. And it fills me with some sadness, even now as a therapist and trauma survivor, of thinking about especially my father, who was the most highly wounded parent in my experience, who he would have been if he had access to authentic self. I know I certainly wouldn't have had as many wounded parts as I had, that's for sure. But yeah, the whole point is that our beautiful wise self is always within us. It's something we don't have access to easily necessarily because we're traumatized, but it doesn't mean that we can't build that beautiful wise self. And that wise self is going to be really key here in reparenting some of our wounded parts. So we'll be getting to that right now. All right, so this next slide and the one after is going to be talking about some of the actual methods that IFS uses to restore this connection to self. And this is called the 6 F's. And so with a good trauma therapist who's trained in IFS, you're going to be exploring part by part by part. And so it's not going to just be 1 or 2 or 3 sessions. This is going to take some time to kind of explore and begin to build relationships with each part. So the whole point of why these parts are causing so much distress is there's no connection between who we authentically really are and the part. And so again, they're like kids in a classroom without a teacher. They don't know that there's this wise adult present or capable of parenting them and guiding them. And so it really is, they don't trust us at first. Oftentimes there's quite a bit of anger from the part to us as we're working with them. And not surprising, right? It's like we've self-abandoned our own parts without even realizing that's what we were doing. So a lot of this is repeated relationship building with the part. As any relationship, the more you work with it, the more it trusts you. And the more it trusts you, the more it's willing to let you lead. And the more you lead, authentic self that is, the more the distress and the symptoms go down. So this works for BPD or complex PTSD or any other disorder. Self-leadership is the key here to reducing suffering. So the first one is called Find in Focus. So this is where we're going to ask clients, for example, maybe they're working on the rage part, for example, the part that has a hard time controlling emotions. We're going to ask them where rage feels, like where they feel it in their body. So maybe they feel it like an intense tightening in their chest, for example, or maybe they're tightening in their shoulders when they start to feel anger developing. And the reason we're going to ask clients this is we're starting to restore that mind-body connection as well. So again, trauma survivors, not only is there disconnection from self, there's disconnection from our bodies. So we want to start to restore that mind-body connection. When we were kids, it wasn't safe to be connected to our bodies. Oftentimes, even the body itself is keeping track of all the trauma. And that's traumatizing to tune in and even feel what our bodies are feeling, because that brings back trauma reminders that are not necessarily verbal or like a memory, but we call it somatic, or body. It's felt body sensations that remind us of the trauma. So some of this is beginning to restore very gently some of that mind-body connection as well by getting clients to be aware of where exactly they're feeling some of these parts within themselves. And we're going to ask them kind of what the part looks like. So sometimes the part shows up very clearly to a client in a specific way, shape, or form. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they can't visualize it, and that's okay too. So there's really no wrong or right way to answer any of these questions. We just go with whatever the client is bringing up, because that's what's most important, is how the part comes across to them. We're going to ask, the next part is fleshing out. We're going to ask them kind of what is the part's story? So I like to find out when the part first began, kind of what I mentioned, a couple clips back. How long has this part been there? Have you been feeling rage since you were 8 or 9 or 10 or something like that? Then we know it's an 8, 9, or 10-year-old. This is not an adult you. This is a child version of you. Very important to recognize. What does the part fear? So for example, we ask the part, what is it afraid of that makes it rage? And so maybe it will say, well, if I'm not raging, then people will not take me seriously, or maybe people will abandon me, or, rage is my last ditch attempt to get my voice heard or to protect myself when nobody's listening to me. So we want to find out kind of what its job is or what its role is in the system. This is very important. Each part has a job or role. Like people pleasing, for example, if I keep everyone happy, no one will hurt me, or maybe I'll finally be loved. What's another common one? Depression. Depression's interesting because depression stops us from feeling anything. Oftentimes, a lot of my clients with serious, long-lasting depression will describe depression like an old friend. It's the only person, the only part, the only, in a way, it's like an old friend that has always been there for them. So we also don't want to get rid of these parts. So that's important to note too. We're not asking the part to go away and get gone and we don't care about you. What we're doing is we're trying to deeply understand the part and then transform or change it and give it a new job or a new role. Like, what if it didn't have to rage anymore? What would it like to do if it didn't have to rage anymore? Right? Oh my gosh. I bet these parts have never even thought about what they could possibly do instead as a new job. Some of the criticizer parts, commonly what I see is they don't know that they're criticizing and yelling and screaming at the client, so to speak, internally, is harming the client. And so you can offer them, hey, how about instead of criticizing or yelling at her all day long, how about you become her ally and her friend and you help protect her from other people who might harm her? Now the part has a new job or role. And I guarantee you it's going to like that job or role a lot more than harming us. And so this is transforming the way these parts relate to us as well. This is what's so beautiful about this model. It's a very deep, holistic level of healing, much deeper than some other modalities that work with complex PTSD or BPD. The next is we're going to begin to befriend the part. And again, a lot of these parts don't trust us at first. Where the heck have we been? There's been no adult present, no captain of the ship. Where have you been? Like, who are you? Get out of here, So we are always trying to befriend and gently get to know the part with curiosity and compassion. Very important qualities. We ask the client, how do they feel towards the part? So if it's anything but like, well, I'm kind of sad that this part has been feeling this way, or I'm really curious to get to know it and what else it might have to say. If they're answering like that, it's a good indicator that self-energy is on board. But if they answer something like, oh, I hate this part. Oh, it just drives me nuts. That's not self-energy. That is another part. So then sometimes you have to begin working with whatever part is showing up, because if it's not self-energy, we're not going to continue working with the part. We only want to work with it if self-energy is on board. And so this is such a wonderful way, I think, of beginning to build this clarity in the system as well, of helping the client understand what is triggering me, what part is active, and then not going straight into judgmental criticizer mode. It's like, okay, I'm beginning to understand why I rage, or why I people please, or why I'm feeling depressed. And no longer is the part the enemy, right? We've become their friend and their ally, and we want to deeply understand them. And as you can imagine, anybody that is being treated with compassion and respect and deep understanding, of course that's going to bring system distress down. It makes perfect sense. All right, this next slide is about restoring self-leadership through figuring out what the part fears. Okay, so this relates to the job or the roles that I was just talking about. So this is a very interesting question to ask these parts. What are they afraid of if they stopped doing their job? Fascinating to hear the answers to some of these questions, because this really gets to the root of why the part keeps doing what it's doing. It does have a certain fear that if it stops doing what it's doing, bad things are going to happen. Every part has good intentions, even if they shoot us in the foot inadvertently or cause us harm. Every part has good intentions. They are attempting to keep us safe in some way, shape, or form. We want to express gratitude and compassion for the part and all the hard work that it's been doing. So I'll ask clients, I want you to tell the part how grateful you are for its hard work and that you recognize it's probably overwhelmed and exhausted. And just that you recognize that it's overwhelmed and exhausted and you appreciate all of its efforts on your behalf. And then notice how the part responds when you are gentle with it. This is where the relationship building begins to take place, and we're transforming the way we relate to our own suffering and creating new brain pathways as well and new neural networks. So there's some cool science behind this as well. All right, we're going to repeat this for every single part. It becomes this kind of wonderful exploration of getting to know each part and how they relate to us and how they relate to one another and how they relate, when triggers happen, etc. So you're really exploring and getting to know your unique system. And what we want is for them to begin to feel safe enough to let us lead, to let self energy lead. And the more we do this, the more the parts begin to trust self and to let self lead. And this visual here that I put is before IFS, right? This is like the analogy I like to give is, okay, classroom without a teacher, pretend you go on a field trip. And again, there's no teacher driving the bus because there's no teacher present. So instead, little Jimmy, who's 6 years old, has to drive the school bus to the zoo. Maybe you have a field trip. Well, you can imagine a 6-year-old driving the school bus and all the other kids, your parts, to the zoo would really be disaster, and the bus would completely crash. And so the image on the right, of course, is after IFS, we have self-leadership on board. Aha, the teacher is back in the classroom and the teacher can drive the bus to the school trip and it gets there safely. So that's the whole idea here. Self-leadership, no longer are we driving the bus off a cliff, for goodness sake. We're finally guiding this bus, this life of ours, in a really beautifully compassionate and connected way with wisdom and clarity and really upholding deep values that are important to us, that add purpose and meaning in our lives. And we have a sense of self finally, right? So this is so important to build that self-leadership so our bus does not get driven off a cliff all the time. So this last slide here, over time, our wounded parts become less active and distressed. They're better able to let self lead. They calm down faster. So if we do get triggered, we're able to recognize very quickly what has triggered us and to calm down a lot faster. They recognize their inherent worthiness. Like no longer do we feel unworthy. We're no longer carrying around these really painful exiles of unworthiness and shame and not good enough, right? Those have been healed, and the protectors are not up in arms all the time trying to protect the exiles from getting triggered. And we're able to respond better to the world around us with courage and clarity instead of, again, those very rapid, volatile emotions, especially with BPD, right? And you, who you really are, your authentic self, without the BPD symptoms, can move through life with purpose and meaning. And that's the whole point of this. And I love to say that we are coming home to ourselves. Like I, not only went through trauma as a child as well, but I had a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I can say for sure that after doing a lot of my own healing work and working in this field, which has been such a pleasure and a privilege to work with so many people with trauma as well. But I think the biggest change is that I'm at home with myself. That's very different. How many of us can say that if we're just sitting in a room by ourselves with no one around us, that it feels deeply safe and calming to be with ourselves? We're not running away from ourselves anymore. We're not running away from emotions or distress or intrusive negative thoughts all the time. We are deeply safe within ourselves. That's the goal here. I want you to come home to yourself, and that yourself is finally this safe, beautiful place to be. And that is the goal here of healing complex trauma And there's hope for everyone who is a trauma survivor with this beautiful therapeutic model. Even those with BPD, you are not untreatable. You're not a lost cause. You're not hopeless. You too can find healing. And I really hope you found this video helpful. You guys have a special place in my heart. Anybody who's been impacted by BPD, you are not at fault for what happened to you as a child. And you can absolutely take the reins back and heal your own trauma, and you are worth it. And so please, if this has been helpful, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you have. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care, everyone.